in case you wonder, my background is the summer palace that got burned
Oh,
down.
oh, what's it called? The Ming, I can't remember, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the
Yuan
garden
Ming
of perfect
Yuan,
the
Yuan Ming
garden of perfect brightness. It's translated into as
yeah,
in English.
yeah.
Um,
As you can see, it's burned down. Yeah.
yes, I think the way the English Orientalists translate these Chinese words does have something of the quality of Orientalism
Yeah,
about them. I have
yeah,
to say, but just
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's called the Yuan Ming Yuan. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
It's actually pretty
yeah.
nice. I always like to go
Oh,
there. They
yeah,
did a lot of cleaning up and everything. So it's more like a nature, more so
right.
than a real
Yeah,
nice
yeah.
palace, right? So, but anyway,
And the ruin, but you can still see some of the ruins. I
yes,
understand.
yes, you can.
And the big summer palace, the one that Cersei
Mhm.
rebuilt, that is quite nearby. I understand. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah. She rebuilt this. Yeah, she rebuilt it. It's nearby. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I must
It's
go. I must go
yes,
someday. Yeah,
definitely.
I
Yes.
really
Yeah.
must. Yeah. Okay. I'm ready. I'm ready to start when you wish.
Yeah, let's
Um.
start with China since we're talking about Yuan
Yeah.
Ming Yuan. So this article that I sent a link to you, whether you had
Mm,
time or not, I thought this week would be a calm week, but we never have calm week, right?
no.
So,
No.
so this article I read, there are quite a few things I want to ask you. The article's name is U.S. Ready's Transnational Kill Chain for Taiwan
Yeah.
Proxy War. Now, the name transnational kill chain, apparently that's the term they use. They use apparently in the Ukraine as well. So, but I'm the first time to read this. It's kind of like just the name got my attention.
Mm, mm,
What is I learned is this link 16 is that's the part of this transnational kill chain that now sold to Taiwan. Even though it's not hugely expensive, like 70 million, $75 million, but part of that is this link 16, which is significant according to this article. It is a jam resistant tactical data network for coordinating NATO weapon systems for joint operation in war.
mm,
And this system allows the Taiwan ROC military to integrate and coordinate all its war fighting platforms with US, NATO, Japanese, Korea, Australia militaries in combined arms warfare. So to
mm.
me, it seems to me like what he's saying here is if the war break out between the mainland and Taiwan, it's not going to be a simple war. Let's say China take over Taiwan in a very short period of time, let's say in a few days, which is most people estimate if China started doing that, taking Taiwan is not shouldn't take that long. But the problem is that doesn't mean the end of the war. The US will use that as an excuse and together with NATO and Japan and Korea and Australia to attack possibly mainland China. Is that what this is?
Well, I'm not going to try and second guess American tactical plans, but let's look at the strategy behind this. This is clearly an act preparing for a general war with China.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about defending Taiwan here. We are talking about a general war with China, integrating together all of the various parts of the Western alliance, which of course includes Japan and Australia, even though they're not in the West, but the collective West, as the Russians have taken to calling it, integrating all their forces in order to fight a war with China in the Pacific region. This is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying information. It is, in my opinion, the single most potent act of escalation that we have seen up to now. So, and of course, the fact that they use these incredible labels to describe these systems in itself really ought to act as an alarm bell. But this is, I think, the single clearest sign that some people in the Pentagon and probably in the National Security Council of the United States are now planning a war with China. This is not a proxy war between the United States and some ally. It's not like the war that's been fought at the moment with Ukraine, in Ukraine, where the US up to this time has been using Ukraine as a proxy. This is a direct war between the United States and its allies and China, with Taiwan being integrated into this whole system.
Yeah, it seems more serious than I thought, because I thought, well, if the mainland, so far, lots of the discussion in the mainland is about, okay, it's so easy to take Taiwan. Why are they waiting? Well, after I read this article, I actually have a better understanding. It seems like it's not going to be just a China, mainland take over Taiwan, because the US will not let it go. I mean, it's not going to be just, okay, you unified and that's it. But US will use that, the so-called protect Taiwan as excuse to actually attack mainland. That's where, and combined with all these forces, and NATO itself has now, how many, 33 members, I believe, plus Japan and Korea, Australia, etc. So that's, like you said, it's a very scary scenario to me.
It is an extremely frightening scenario. Now, there's a number of things to say. If we talk about the Chinese reaction, I think it now explains very clearly certain strategic decisions that the Chinese civil and military leadership are taking. And one of the most important is to prioritize development of China's strategic nuclear forces. This is because if you are looking at a potential war with the United States, at the moment, the United States has the capabilities to launch nuclear strikes upon China on a massive scale. China does not have a matching capability, because up to this time, China has not wanted it. So it's been content for the Russians and the Americans to engage each other in an arms race, but the Chinese basically kept out of it. Now it's going to be different. And I think that this is an important point of departure for China. They understand that in order to prevent such a general war from happening, they have to make it clear to the Americans that you're not just taking on the Chinese conventional forces. You are potentially involving yourself in a superpower nuclear war in which your very existence is going to be at risk. So I think that's the first thing I would say about this. The second is, of course, it does explain a lot about the urgency of Chinese military action, build-ups in the Pacific and the South China Sea, the emphasis on the Navy, the development of hypersonic glide vehicles, the development of submarines, all of the things that we are talking about. And it also, exactly as you said, goes very far to explain why China is taking its time, because it is aware of the extent to which the United States outmatches China in terms of strategic nuclear forces. So it has to develop its nuclear forces, its intercontinental ballistic missiles, and other, long-range bombers, and do things like that, which, to be absolutely clear again, China has never wanted to do. It's never been part of the Chinese military thinking, but they have to do it because it's, as you correctly say, we're not just talking about a war about Taiwan. We are talking about a war between China and the United States. And what China needs to do is to raise the potential costs for the United States beyond the point where the Americans themselves can risk this. So it explains a great deal. And it explains something else, which is why the Americans have been trying to get the Russians to agree to strategic arms reduction treaty, in which the United States has parity with both Russia and China. This has been a theme that the Americans have been pushing on the Russians for years. Very bizarrely, and this is really quite extraordinary, but Putin discussed this in his recent presidential address. The Americans, despite the war in Ukraine, have still been trying to get the Russians to agree to this. They've been talking about what they call strategic stability talks with the Russians, which is code word for strategic arms reduction. But on this basis, and the Russians are saying, not interested, we're not doing this. We insist that our nuclear arsenal should be at least as potent as yours. And what the Chinese do, it's entirely up to them. We're not allies. We may be in a strategic partnership with the Chinese, but we're not allies with them. And besides, you've never agreed to count the nuclear weapon systems of your allies, the British and the French, in your totals. And we're certainly not going to do that with China's. So it makes an awful lot of sense of an awful lot that has been going on, which has not up to this point been clear.
That's such a great point, because that's also answered another question of mine for a long time, is that why is China so interested in building up its nuclear arsenals? Because not that long ago, a few years ago, I remember I read somewhere that the Chinese military, before everything goes so ugly now, the Chinese military actually has regular contact with the US military. And some of those retired generals, they actually come out and talk about different things. So they said a few years back, they had a conversation with their counterparts, the U.S. military, and they said, we're fully aware that the United States can destroy China 100 times over, but for us, we are satisfied with the destroy United States over one time. So that's the sentiment at least a few years back. But it seems like China realized that even though you destroy United States one time over should be enough to deter these people, but these people are not deterred. You have to have overwhelming power over them for the United States to fully realize how serious this is, right? Isn't that explains it?
This is exactly correct. And this is, by the way, the same conclusion that the Russians reached back in the 1960s. And now, again, you have to go back to the early and middle period of the Cold War, but up to the mid 1960s, the Russians did not attempt to match the Americans in terms of equality of nuclear forces. They eventually decided that they had no choice but to do that. And that decision came after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, because they saw how dangerous the situation with the US had become, how willing the United States was to risk nuclear war, even despite the fact that a nuclear war with the United States at that time would have resulted in the Soviets being able to cause enormous devastation on the United States at that period. But the US had much greater nuclear force capability at that time than the Soviet Union did. It was not deterred. There were US generals and admirals and officials who were lobbying President Kennedy to actually go all out for war. President Kennedy himself was horrified by this, but he was only one person, and as we know, he was subsequently assassinated in circumstances which we're not going to discuss today. But anyway, the long and the short of it was that thereafter, the Soviets said to themselves, we have no real choice. We must, at the very least, obtain equality with the Americans in strategic weapons. And they did. It was a huge industrial and technological undertaking throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. But by the early 1970s, they'd achieved it. And that, by the way, resulted in the period known as détente, when it finally came to be realized in the United States that they could not gain a military victory over the Soviet Union. And it seems to me the same calculus now applies with even greater force to China. It's not, as I said, something the Chinese themselves wanted to do, but they've come to realize that with the Americans, there is no other way.
Yeah, because in this article, they also talked about these people are talking about the first nuclear strike, right? Which is really scary, that they are seriously talking about the first nuclear strike. And China has made it very clear that China will not do the first nuclear strike. But as far as I know, China probably is the only country of all the known nuclear powers have said that, and nobody else seems interested in that. I think if all the nuclear powers agree that we are not going to be the first nuclear strike country, then I think we won't have a nuclear war. But that's really scary.
Well, it is. Now, the Soviets back in the early 80s announced that they would not be the first to use nuclear weapons.
Okay.
But then what happened was that some years ago, the Russians changed the policy.
Yeah.
They dropped the policy. So again, as the international situation we deteriorated. Now let's take a step back and speak about firstly how dangerous this is. That the Americans are literally actively planning a war with China. I mean, it is incredible and terrifying, but also how crazy it is. It is crazy because, of course, this puts the whole of human civilization at risk. That is the first point, and the obvious and the most important point. But assuming we get through this, which we will, because, you know, Russia is strong militarily, China is soon going to become very strong militarily. What it is going to do is that instead of the United States being confronted by one nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union, and then Russia, as it has been since the 1960s, it's going to be confronted with two. I mean, it's ultimately a completely self-defeating policy. But there again lies the danger, because the Americans will be seeing the fact that the Chinese strategic nuclear forces are growing in power and strength, and China, with its much greater manufacturing and technological abilities than the United States, will be able to achieve that very, very quickly. And undoubtedly, there will be people in the Pentagon, in the National Security Council, in the think tank community, who will be saying, we've got to strike before the window of advantage closes. And by the way, that also was a discussion that was happening in the United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s with respect to the Soviet Union. So we are looking at a very dangerous and difficult time ahead of us.
Yeah, because that's another thing that this article was talking about, the urgency, right? The urgencies of some of the think tanks. So let's talk about the think tank first, which is another topic I really want to discuss with you. This article also told us how important the think tanks are, because all these, he mentioned a few places like the Center for a New American Security, Center for Strategic International Studies, and then the Rand Corporation, and of course the Pentagon. So they work together, work on this strategy against China for 10 years, which to me, that means they are not going to easily give up, because they work so hard on this to prepare for those whole thing. So that's scary by itself, just because they have been working so long. And then it also tells us that the think tank and lobby many times go together. Their influence, right? They are very much if we talk so much about the deep state, they are part of an important part of the deep state, isn't it? Victoria Nuland herself also was, I believe she was, when she was out of the government, when Trump was the president, she was the chair of this Center for New American Security, which is funded by Michelle Flournoy, which is the Undersecretary of Defense, I think, under Obama, and also the incoming, this guy, Kurt Campbell, the incoming Secretary, Undersecretary of State, right? So they're all together. These people are either in the government or in the think tank, isn't it? They are the deep state, isn't it?
You are absolutely correct about this. You see, I spend a huge amount of time plowing through the materials, so the think tanks and, you know, all that assorted horrible subculture, sorry to use that word, in Washington are producing. And I have to say, I find the material that they produce absolutely terrifying on an everyday basis. I also find it at some level mad. I use that word because merely thinking in this way says to me that you are a most unusual person. I mean, most people, one would assume, do not sit around the table and talking with each other about how they're going to wage nuclear war tomorrow against China. So, I mean, this is a very strange and rather disturbing group of people. But of course, they are absolutely an integrated part of the American military, industrial, political security system. So at the center of it all, the core of it, there is the Rand Corporation, which is largely controlled by the Pentagon. That is an analytical center, which does analysis. It used to do it very well. Today, it's also gone down the rabbit hole of crazy thinking. But the think tanks are clustered around it, and there are lots of them. There are so many of them, and each of them has its own publications and funding behind them. And of course, they're all connected to the big military industrial arms companies. They all have their contacts and friends in the Pentagon. They all meet together. They all socialize together. They all talk with each other. They have big lobbying groups in Congress. They have sympathetic people in Congress who work with them. And of course, many people in government, in the formal government of the United States as well. The think tanks are a part of the American government. Now, it's not understood that way. They always tell you that they're independent. They're just think tanks. But this has become the way the American government works. It doesn't discuss this sort of thing in its own official publications, because those are there to project an image of peace and friendship, and, well, to a certain point. So these think tanks exist so this kind of thinking can go on there, and the American government can pretend that it is not connected to it, whereas we can all see that it is.
Yeah, so now I kind of like figure out how the deep state works, right? So the military industry complex and the big corporations, they sponsor these think tanks, right? And basically grooming these people, right? And so these people are in the government for a long time, and they're in or out of the government, between the government, the official government, and the think tanks, right? Victoria Nuland's whole family, right? It's not just her, she's herself was in the think tank and in the government, in and out.
Yeah.
But also her husband, right, Robert Kagan, and her husband's brother, Frederick Kagan, and I think the Frederick Kagan's wife, they all in the think tanks. I think this whole, I think Gonzalo Lira calls them the cabal, the whole cabal, right? And so now I kind of like understand how this whole deep state, how they all connect together, that they're always there. This group, the same group of people, they're always there, right? They are the ones eventually making the decisions, right?
Absolutely. Now, I've never been to Washington, D.C. myself, but I understand that this world is relatively small. I mean, they're all in Georgetown and wherever it is. So, of course, they all, they mix constantly with each other. And, of course, the media itself plays a very big role in this. So let's say that NBC wants to do a TV program about the situation in the Taiwan Straits, and they want so-called independent experts. They will go to this think tank community. They'll get an expert there. That person will appear on the program, perhaps in a discussion with an expert from another think tank. Of course, what we're actually seeing is people who belong to the power structure in Washington. It's a united power structure. But to the American people, it is presented differently. It is a very terrifying thing. And, I've talked with people who know this world, and I mean, they've described it to me in detail, but that is exactly what it is.
Maybe you and Alex should do a program about the think tanks, because I don't
We
think
should do.
Yeah, because it's a very important topic, very important part of the U.S. government, and not many people talk about them, right? Like you said, they are being portrayed as independent, but they are not. They are really not independent.
No. America is this very strange thing of the public and the private, and they interconnect, and that makes, and there really isn't that separation that there is supposed to be in other places. In China, in Russia, it isn't like that at all. But in the US, the private and the public just merge into each other in a kind of seamless way, which is very confusing for outsiders.
Yeah, and the same thing with the media. They always give you the impression the media is independent because they're private, but they're not, right? The same thing, They, as soon as they say it's independent, they give you the impression that it is unrelated, somehow unrelated to the government, fully
Correct.
separated from government, but they are not in reality. Yeah.
Correct. That's absolutely right. That is completely correct.
Yeah. And then talking about this new guy, Kurt Campbell, that's another thing scary to me when I was reading this article is, again, this is a think tank lobby person now coming into the government. I mean, he has been in there. So he is the co-founder of this Center of New American Security, and he also was the CEO of the Asian Group, which is another think tank lobby company. Now he's the Deputy Secretary of State. Okay. In this article here, he says he sees Ukraine as a unified field, in his words, of war with China. He revels the possibility of a magnificent symphony of death in Asia. This is the part that really scares me. Apparently, this is his own word when he was giving a speech in the University of Chicago a few years ago. This is when he was talking about if there is a new war in Korea. And he said that there will be a magnificent symphony of death in the valleys of North Korea. This is a maniac, a lunatic.
Yeah, I completely agree. What can I add about this? It's a point I have made many times, which is I remain of the view that what is happening in Washington at the moment is that the Russia hawks, the Victoria Nuland, and that crowd are gradually being pushed out. But the people who are taking over from them are not people who seek peace. They're not rational, sane people. They're just people who want a war in another place against an even bigger enemy. And Kurt Campbell is just an example of this. He wanted to use Ukraine in a certain way. Well, that hasn't really worked out. He doesn't care too much. So, but his real focus always has been Asia, Korea, China, most of all. And those are the people who are taking control. They're even madder. They're even more insane than the Russia hawks are. Because the Russia hawks, Russia isn't as powerful a country, not remotely, as the US is. I mean, it's got a much smaller economy. Its armed forces are much smaller in aggregate than those of the US. It does have an enormously powerful strategic force and a very joined up and intelligent government. But it is not quite as powerful. China is. And yet these people are itching to take it on.
Yeah, which is why after I read this article, it really, I mean, I guess it's finally sinking into me, like what exactly going on, because there's a lot of confusion for me, right? So it seems like they replaced Victoria Nuland, which I think is a maniac herself, and replace her with another maniac, Kurt Campbell.
A more dangerous one.
Yeah.
I have, in fairness to Victoria Nuland, I've never heard her use language like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I never have done.
Yeah. My goodness. Okay. And which is why when I look at Biden now, it seems like less hawkish than they are, because at least in his State of Union, when he's talking about China, he said, I want competition with China, not conflict. But then immediately he said that we're in a stronger position to win the conflict. So he just said he doesn't want to have a conflict with China, but then immediately saying we are in a strong position to win the conflict in the 21st century against China than anyone else, for that matter, than any time as well. So at least he says that, okay, I don't want a conflict. And even that is not hawkish enough for Atlantic Council, which said, okay, it's incorrect to say we want competition with China, not conflict. So that they literally immediately followed his speech, saying you cannot even say that you don't want to have a conflict. We just want to have conflict with China. These are
this is correct too. I mean, about Biden is part of a tradition of US policy. I should say, I'm taking this from my colleague and friend, Glenn Deason, the professor at Oslo University. He's written a very fine book discussing both China, Russia, all of these things. But he points out that one of the tactics that the Americans like to use is they come along and they come up with all kinds of words which appear to suggest that, they're moderate, they're not actually looking for conflict. They don't talk about conflict, they talk about competition. These are not really seriously intended. They're intended more to pull the wool over people's eyes, to make them think that, this isn't, that maybe the Americans aren't that bad after all, so we can make a concession to them here and make a concession to them there, and then we come to some kind of understanding with them. And of course, what will happen then is that the Americans will just go on advancing. Glenn Deason, by the way, if you read his book, he's quite clear that he believes that the Americans rather, were preparing for a first nuclear strike against Russia. The whole build-up and process was headed in that direction. So that's what this is all about. It's so-called salami tactics.
Mhm.
You take and you say sweet things, and then you take more, and then you say more sweet things, and you go on taking until you have it all, or you put the other side in a position of such vulnerability that they collapse or capitulate. So that's what Biden is doing, which is very much the strategy, by the way, the US also used at the end of the Cold War. The Soviets, Gorbachev, didn't understand it, but that's what they were doing then. And remember, Biden belongs in that period. But there are younger, harder-nosed people in Washington. They understand that this doesn't work anymore. They understand they can't fool the Russians any longer. And there've been enough bruising encounters now with Chinese officials, with Wang Yi in particular, for them to know perfectly well that the Chinese aren't fooled either. So they say, well, let's no longer waste our time with this pretense. All that it is doing is it's creating some degree of incoherence within our own alliance system and within our own policy making body. Let's be absolutely straightforward. Call the Chinese the enemy and just get on with it. So, I mean, that group is now, I think, getting stronger. And one of the reasons they're getting strong is because they know, firstly, that the Chinese see through it. That's one. And that the Chinese are not the Soviets and they won't be fooled. I mean, there's no Gorbachev figure coming in China. So that's one thing. And the second is that they know that they're running out of time. So that's the urgency that they're pushing.
So interesting you bring up this slice the salami, because I just saw some similar talking about that in the Chinese media. Somebody also used this term. Probably they learned from, yeah. But what they were saying is that the NATO has been sliced the salami, trying to test the limit, the Russian limit. But it's dangerous now because what the Chinese analyst was saying that the salami, you keep on slicing it. It probably come to a point you are going to slice to your own fingers. Now that is a very dangerous situation, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's exactly right, and that's exactly what's happened in Ukraine, and it's going to happen on a much bigger scale in the Pacific. I mean, they will slice their own fingers. That's a very, very clever metaphor, if I may say. I might borrow it from this person, whoever he or she was.
Yeah, this is I think he teaches at a military school, and he's doing a social network a little bit himself. So I follow him from time to time. Yeah.
Well, there you go, because you see a Chinese official says that. I remember, following what the Soviets were doing in the late 80s, for example, in the 80s, under Gorbachev. No Soviet official spoke in those terms. Okay. I mean, they didn't understand. They didn't understand what was going on. An earlier generation of Soviet officials would have done, but Gorbachev's day, they didn't.
Yeah.
The Chinese do.
Yeah, but Gorbachev was fooled by the West more.
Yeah, absolutely. He was, as he essentially admitted himself later.
Okay. Since we're talking about State of Union, so as Biden's State of Union, I have to say, is very, other than this part, interesting to me, that because talking about China. Otherwise, I think it's a State of Union is kind of like a campaign speech, more or less. I'm not too impressed by it. But what's interesting is at the same time, Putin is addressing the Assemble, which is his version of State of Union. And because of the two sessions, so Li Qiang is the prime minister is giving a government report. It's almost like a State of Union by itself. So it's just interesting to me that three countries are doing more or less the same thing, right, to their people, but they're very different. I feel like Putin was very confident, very energetic in his State of Union. Is that your impression?
That is absolutely what he was. He was very confident. He was looking forward. He was planning ahead. He was thinking beyond the current situation and charting a very interesting course for Russia. I also get the sense with Putin, and I've had it for some time, by the way, that in a strange kind of way, what has happened has freed him. That he feels almost liberated. I mean, he's had to spend decades pretending that there was some way forward with the Americans, being very careful in the kind of language he used, always probably internally very, very angry, and having always to worry about doing things in terms of economic or domestic policies, which might which wouldn't offend the Americans, wouldn't offend American or Western investors, wouldn't upset the Germans, all of that kind of thing. Because of course, the Russia that he inherited had been very deeply integrated into the Western system, into the Western economic system, in a way that China's has never been. So suddenly, all that's ended. It's gone, and he feels that he can now speak straightforwardly and do the kind of things he wants, and he doesn't have to worry about what people in Washington and London and Berlin and Frankfurt and New York think. And that gives him a sense of release that I've never seen in him before.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then also now Li Qiang's report, or government report, is very much domestic policies. And but one thing lots of people notice that he's not giving a prime minister press conference afterwards. Now Wang Yi gave one for all the reporters, but so the interpretation of the prime minister didn't give one is this in China is like originally the purpose of the press conference is actually very much accommodating the foreign press because he has been giving a speech and it's very detailed in terms of what the government has done and what government is planning to do. So there's not a whole lot of question. Plus, the Chinese domestic media, they can have plenty of opportunities to ask him questions. So they don't need this press conference really. So it really was established to accommodate the foreign press. The fact that they get rid of it is just another sign. It's like whatever you say, I don't care anymore because I try to explain to you my policies, my country. I have been doing this for all these years, but it doesn't stop you from lying about me, smearing about me, lecturing me. That's it. I'm not doing this anymore. That was the interpretation by the Chinese media.
Well, they're absolutely correct, and again, it tells you very much that just as the Russians have now said to themselves, we don't have to worry about these people in the West anymore. The Chinese have come to the same conclusion. I mean, why bother with a press conference when you're only going to be abused and asked questions which aren't really questions? I mean, they're simply attempts to put you on the spot, and which ultimately don't take you forward in any conceivable way, and where anything that you say will be twisted and made to sound like the opposite of what you did say. So, I mean, the Chinese, I think, have come to that conclusion. They don't want to go there. I just want to say something about these three reports, because there was some similarity for me between the Russian and the Chinese ones, in that they're full of facts, figures, information, detailed plans. You can see they're a government, and both the China and Putin. It's not just Putin coming up with these things. He is expressing what the collective government is thinking and intending to do. I mean, this is a much more collective system than I think people understand in Russia, and of course in China also. So this is a proper government program in both cases, and discussed in a very non-dogmatic way. If you switch not just to Biden's State of the Union address, but the way State of the Union address have become in the United States, they are not that anymore. I mean, you're absolutely right. Biden's speech was to a great extent a campaigning speech. It was also riddled again with dogma, generalities, themes, wild allegations, abuse of others. It it was completely different. The feel of it was totally different from what the Chinese and the Russians do.
Yeah, and then I saw you and Alex talked about this, that he's a very angry man. That's how I feel too. When I was watching him, I forced myself to watch it,
Oh,
but
no,
it's not enjoyable to watch
no.
it versus, when I was listening to Li Qiang's government report, I was interested. What is he saying? Okay, this is what you have done and what's your plan, and they also very open about pointing the problems in China. These are the issues that we have, and this is what we have done and the progress we make, but also there are still more things need to be done. It's interesting in that sense that they are concrete, like you said, concrete policies and actions, etc. Whereas Biden's is a lot of screaming and soundbite, and of course, like you said, the first I would say a third is about talking about the bad mouthing Trump without naming Trump,
Yeah.
right? Isn't that what it's so boring in the sense that, at least how I feel.
Well, it's boring, and I would have thought completely inappropriate. I mean, it's not what the State of the Union, I imagine, was for. You're absolutely right. He looks furious. He looks furious at every single moment through the speech. I mean, he sort of stands there, and his face has a sort of angry, robotic look about it. I found it, frankly, deeply awful to watch. And I'm not talking now about his medical problems, which we've all know about. I'm simply saying the actual optics of it, I thought were ghastly and very frightening, actually. I mean, very angry with the Russians, very angry ultimately with the Chinese, even though he was a bit more careful in what he said about them, because, as I said, he still has to pretend that he's trying to get on with them. Very, very angry with his domestic opponents in the United States. Furious that he's having to take on Donald Trump again. Furious that the Supreme Court of the United States isn't giving him everything that he wants. And the anger was palpable. And, in our program, Alex and I just discussed, and Alex came up with this theory that he has to be angry in order to get through his speeches. And I think there is an element of truth to this. And I think that probably there is some, medical help, medications that he's given, which probably propel him forward in that way. But you can't just simulate anger like that. He is generally a very angry man. This has been my feeling about him for a very long time. And of course, angry people are not safe making decisions.
Yeah. That's why he's dangerous. Yes, he's angry because when you're angry, it clouds your judgment. We all know that, right? So yeah. Okay, I
Well,
want to also.
there's a very famous English expression that decisions made in anger are repented at leisure, which is absolutely true, by the way. As a former lawyer, I can tell you how absolutely true that comment is.
Yeah. I also want to talk to you about Armenia. So Armenia talking about their foreign minister now recently said they are considering seeking the EU membership. So there are quite a few questions I want to ask you. First of all, I doubt EU would allow Armenia to join EU. Now, if it did, it would really upset Turkey, isn't it?
Yeah. It would infuriate the Turks, it would infuriate Azerbaijan, and it would annoy the Russians. It's an incredibly foolish policy, but it is completely consistent with what the government of Nikol Pashinyan has been doing ever since it came to power following street protests in Armenia some years ago. And you see the same story here. You have, again, it's outside NGOs, Western NGOs. Money pours in. The Armenian media has been all bought up, mainly by American people. The NGOs pay far higher salaries than Armenian companies do, so they attract a certain type of young person. They become very influential in Armenian political life. Pashinyan himself, by the way, is a former journalist. And the Armenians are sold this story that they can be part of the West, that they can join the EU, perhaps eventually join NATO, that the relationship with Russia doesn't really work for them. And they come to believe it themselves. It becomes almost a religious belief amongst some Armenians. And in the meantime, Armenia itself is antagonizing all its old friends, and it is putting itself in extreme danger because, as you rightly say, Turkey is there and will not tolerate an Armenia within the EU. And Azerbaijan, its militarily much more powerful neighbor, which has a long-standing feud with Armenia, is now claiming more Armenian territory because it is sensing an opportunity. So it's a totally misguided policy, but one which resembles very much the one that Ukraine has been led to follow. And it's going to have the same disastrous outcome if it is followed through to its conclusion.
Yeah, that's my question, because for a long time, Russia has been doing a pretty good job to keep Armenia and Azerbaijan, right, kind of peaceful, right? Even though there's always a quarrel, but I feel like Russia has been doing pretty good job to keep them both kind of like trying to be peaceful. But now it's getting more dangerous. I mean, that's another area that has historically has been complicated area, isn't it? The Armenia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. I mean, that is also another potential problematic area, isn't it?
This is completely true. I mean, the thing to understand is that the reason Armenia and, by the way, Georgia exist at all is because of Russia. And this has been, this isn't a modern thing. It goes all the way back to the late 18th century when the Armenians and the Russians, sorry, the Armenians and the Georgians, there were two little kingdoms at that time in the Caucasus, Christian kingdoms, were feeling under intense pressure from the Ottoman Empire and indeed the Persian Empire at that time, and were conscious of the fact that they were at risk of extinction. So they asked the Russian Empress, Catherine the Great, to bring them in to the Russian Empire. So that was how Russia expanded to include these two regions. This is in the late 18th century, because they needed Russia to be there to act as their protector. And this has continued all the way through. I mean, after the Russian Empire collapsed, following the 1917 revolution, again, there was a major campaign by the Ottomans to eradicate Armenians from eastern Anatolia. It would have undoubtedly extended to Armenia itself. It was because the Soviets came in and stabilized the situation that Armenia itself, in its present boundaries, was preserved, and it flourished, I should say, as a republic of the Soviet Union. Now, ever since then, firstly, the Armenians sought independence, as the Georgians did, which, given their neighborhood, was already a risky thing to do. But especially since Mr. Pashinyan has come to power, and then earlier Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia, they have been looking to antagonize the Russians and to drift away from them. And the result is that both Armenia and Georgia have been losing territory, and are faced with a situation where the environment around them is gradually and steadily becoming more hostile. They need to have good relations with Russia. Georgia is less vulnerable because it has fewer enemies, but Armenia in particular is in a desperately vulnerable position. I know many Armenians understand this, but there is a group of people in Armenia who clearly don't want to see it. And we could quite plausibly soon have another Armenian-Azerbaijanian war. Armenia will lose. It is militarily completely outmatched by Azerbaijan, which is backed by Turkey. It will lose more territory, and then the process will just continue. And one can even imagine a situation where Armenia, one of the most ancient countries in the world, by the way, it has existed since about 100 years before Christ. I mean, it was an important player in the Roman Empire and all that. Armenia might actually, as a state, cease to exist, which would be a tragedy.
You see, it's so frustrating to see these kind of things. Despite what's going on in Ukraine, which is clear as the sky, that everybody can see what is going on, but you still keep on having these kind of these kind of government, right? Armenian government, and to me, like the current Taiwan government, they're still believing in the West. They still believing their future lies with the West. It's almost like you're watching a bus heading to a cliff, and they don't seem aware of that, right?
Well, this is completely true. I mean, I have to say, these people function inside an ecosystem in which they are told. I mean, everybody around them, because they all spend all their time together. The newspapers they read, the books they read, all of those things tell them that the West is good, the West is best. That's where life is freest. We have pop music, which is a major factor, by the way, not to be underestimated. The sort of Western pop culture and all that. All of those things, you can have all of that, and at the same time, the West is so powerful that we can make this choice and we'll be safe. And those who argue otherwise are not people who are realists, but they're corrupt. They're owned by the Russians, or they're owned by the Chinese, and they're authoritarians, and they're either rightists if they're backed by the Russians, or they're leftists if they're backed by the Chinese. But anyway, we can ignore them. And it is all very much based upon a belief in Western power, in the assumption that ultimately the West will always prevail, because to their understanding, it always has done and must therefore always do so. And of course, it isn't entirely a historical concept. But if you do encounter these people, which I have done many times, by the way, you find that they just don't want to see this. They just close their minds, and they simply won't look outside that. It's to do so would undermine their own self beliefs. So as I said, they won't do that.
Yeah, and the part of the tragedy is that when things not go well, it is not the decision makers who are suffering. It is the regular people, right?
Yeah.
There is no accountability in that sense. That is so tragic, So and frustrating.
You are absolutely correct. I mean, this is what's happened in Ukraine. It's going to happen in Armenia. It already happened in that Armenian region of Nagorno-Karabakh, where all the people were driven out. It's going to happen to all of these people. And there is this elite that has the levers of power, that lives in this bubble. They all talk with each other. Their response, by the way, to any challenge from below, because people below are not stupid. They can see what's going on. They do sometimes try and bring up parties and things like that. The automatic presumption of these people who live inside this bubble is that people like that should be suppressed. They should be closed down, because, well, that's the way it must be. And we see that in Ukraine, where parties have been banned. And before long, I'm afraid we'll see it in Armenia too.
Yeah, and Taiwan is doing that too, that lesser degree, that they are banning TV channels and the media companies that they don't like. They're doing that too.
Exactly.
And then the West are calling them the democracy, etc.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's the democratic authoritarianism, which is now becoming very prevalent. It is in the West, but of course, even more so in these places.
Okay, so Zelensky is recently visited Turkey. So during that visit, Erdogan came out saying he's willing to host a peace summit of some sort. But he actually said that Russia need to be involved, this peace summit. So is there anything come out of that? What's your estimate of that?
Well, Zelensky again absolutely categorically refused this. I mean, he wants peace, but he doesn't really want peace. He wants a total capitulation by the Russians, which, I mean, is now becoming completely delusional. I mean, it is like Hitler in the bunker, saying that I will want victory on my terms, and I'm not prepared to accept anything else. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but it is starting to go in that direction. Unfortunately, the Americans still seem to be with him. Now, the origin of this, the point where all this began, was in August last year, which is in Copenhagen. And the Americans, Jake Sullivan to be precise, the National Security Advisor, called together a summit meeting of important countries from the global south, the Western countries, and Ukraine. And quite obviously, this meeting in Copenhagen was intended to happen at the same time as it was expected that the Ukrainians would achieve a breakthrough in their summer offensive and would be advancing towards the Black Sea. The idea was that the Americans and the Ukrainians would announce terms in effect for Russian capitulation, and that the other countries in the world, China, India, Turkey, all the others, would rubber stamp this because, they wouldn't want a total military collapse in Russia. So the idea was you get the global south to and the other big countries to unite behind the Americans and the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have achieved this victory on the battlefield. People come along, tell the Russians, look, enough's enough. You've lost the war. Just accept what the Americans are demanding. Well, it turned out otherwise. The offensive failed. It was comprehensively defeated. And the Americans and the Ukrainians and the other Western powers were left at this meeting high and dry. But being the stubborn people that they are, they weren't willing to accept the message, which was already given to them by China, by India, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, by the way. Well, you're going to negotiate if you are going to be serious about negotiations. You can't just dictate terms to the Russians. You've got to negotiate with the Russians. You've got to start talks. And Zelensky refuses to do that outright. The Americans aren't prepared to do this. What happened at a recent meeting of this group in Malta is that more and more countries stayed away. China stayed away. They said, this simply doesn't make any sense anymore. Saudi Arabia stayed away. Apparently, Turkey was still there. And Erdogan has been trying to get the Americans and the Ukrainians to understand that this Copenhagen process, as it is called, just is absurd. It really doesn't make any sense. Now, the next in the series of these conferences is supposed to happen in Switzerland. And the Swiss and the Chinese, by the way, who can see where all this is going. The Swiss, who don't want to see this conference fail, it's already had to be postponed because so many big countries are staying away. They've each recently issued statements saying, and Switzerland is essentially a part of the West now. They've each issued statements saying this isn't working. If we're going to go ahead with this, we have to have the Russians participating. And Zelensky went to Turkey, not entirely clear what he thought he was going to achieve there. But as far as Erdogan is concerned, he tried also to get Zelensky to hear this. And Zelensky refused. He wasn't listening. And if you see the body language and the expressions of the two leaders afterwards, they both look furious, especially Erdogan. And it's clear that meeting went badly wrong.
Yeah, that's why it's kind of like a strange. What's the purpose of his trip, right? Why did he go? He should know what Erdogan would tell him, right? So there is a rumor about ousting Sunak and bring back Boris Johnson. Is there merit to it? Are they kidding?
Yes, there is merit to it, not in the sense that this is a good idea. It's a terrible idea. But desperate people think of crazy things. This is a crazy thing. but the Conservatives are becoming very, very desperate because their big hope and expectation was that the government announced its budget last week. It was the moment when it was expected that this would change the prospects for the government. The Conservatives unrolled tax cuts. Of course, they're not really tax cuts, but they were pretend tax cuts. And that was just supposed to be an eye-catching thing, and it was going to make people very enthusiastic about voting Conservative again. And the budget went down like a stone. People didn't like it at all. The general public didn't like it at all. So the Conservatives are currently polling around 20%, which is an unprecedented low for this party. Labour is polling around 43%, double what the Conservatives are. There's going to be an election at some point this year. Everybody can see that the Conservatives are going to go down to a colossal defeat. They don't want to change the policy. They sense that the Prime Minister himself, Sunak, is not winning over people. So they say to themselves, some desperate people say, well, nothing we can do can probably save the election, but let's bring back Boris Johnson. He's a larger than life personality. He has a way of engaging with the British people, or at least some of them. And if we bring him back, maybe instead of a total collapse and a potential extinction event, we'll be able simply to suffer a massive defeat, which in this kind of situation would be better. So this is the kind of thinking. I mean, it's actually an absurd idea, and it completely misreads sentiment in Britain. Most people in Britain do not feel any particular desire to have Boris Johnson back.
But I guess at this point they have nothing to lose. I guess it cannot be much worse. Okay.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that is exactly what I think some of them are saying. I mean, let's bring back Johnson, and maybe that will somehow turn things around. I think I've lost count. I think he'd be the fourth prime minister they've had since the last election. I mean, it was Johnson, then it was Truss, then it was Sunak, then it would be Johnson again. I mean, it would be very bizarre.
Yeah. And Britain's economy is, doesn't seem doing well. So I read that the Britain is considered selling aircraft carrier, Prince of Wales. Is that a sign that the economy is really bad?
Yeah, it is absolutely. I mean, again, the figures, the GDP figures, don't convey to outsiders the full sense of malaise, the full sense of decline here. But briefly, productivity in Britain has all but collapsed. There's no real growth in the economy, and hasn't been for some time. Real wages are falling. Debt levels, generally, government debt is also rising. And there's a general sense that nobody in Britain, nobody in government knows what to do. There are lots of schemes and plans and theories about what to do, but none of them have come together and represent a coherent policy, because coherent policies would require a break, a significant break from the kind of policies that the political class are heavily invested in. I mean, it would mean, for example, one possible way would be to seek peace in Europe. I mean, that's an obvious one. End the Ukraine war, come to a negotiated solution, see some way to resolve things in that way. That would be one. It wouldn't solve the problems, but it would make them less bad, because we might start to get energy flows from Russia moving westwards again, possibly, in which case, perhaps energy costs might fall, perhaps. So that's one thing you could do. Or the other thing you could do is you could do what David Cameron had been trying to do when he was prime minister, forge a very close relationship with China, tell the Chinese, invest in our country. We're a gateway for you. We've lost most of our industry, but you've got lots of industry. We're good at services. We can do that, and we can work together, and we'll be joining your banks and all that kind of thing. That's another policy that you could do. You could shift ground radically. But the political class doesn't want to do any of these things. So they have run out of things to do. And on the one hand, they talk about increasing defense spending, but Britain is running a massive budget. The government wasn't able to announce any increase in defense spending in its budget, the one that happened last week. It remains flat. As a result, because the amount of spending on defense doesn't match the extravagant needs that the British are imposing on their military. I mean, they want their military to do all kinds of things, which are way beyond what the existing levels of funding can provide. So the result is that the entire military is gradually decomposing. There's only 40 operational tanks. That's 40 operational tanks. Now, this is the country that, within living memory was a superpower. It's got 40 operational tanks. They're having to scrap a third of their air force. They've given away all their artillery to Ukraine. There are no self-propelled guns anymore. And these two aircraft carriers, which were created at such enormous expense for Britain. Britain doesn't really have the resources to build aircraft carriers anymore. That was a mistake anyway. But anyway, they did. They had to have aircraft carriers. They were never able to work them through properly. So both of these aircraft carriers have constant mechanical problems. They're always breaking down. And they never were able to afford the fighter jets that these aircraft carriers need to have in order to fly, which are American. The British don't make fighter jets like that any longer. And they come at an enormous cost. So, and of course, on top of everything else, they have their nuclear strategic deterrent, and it launched a missile. Only the missile didn't actually launch; it stayed where it was. So they got all of these problems, and they have to have some kind of a military. So they're not able to increase the funding for the military. So some people are now realistically saying, well, let's just get rid of these aircraft carriers. They're not doing anything. Let's sell one off. Now, that, from an accountant's point of view, is probably the correct decision. But it would be a national humiliation.
Yeah.
That would be difficult for the British people to accept, I think.
Yeah, that's when I first read it. That's the first thinking I had was, are they serious? Because it's so, like you said, it's humiliating. Yeah. Now, GDP, I just feel like a GDP is a pretty bad way to reflect the country. Now, I find that the West they fall into the GDP trap, because when they made decision to punish Russia, to invade, to start this whole Ukraine project, one thing they did was to look at the GDP, Russia's GDP. And I remember they said that Russia's GDP is the same as Italy. But that's in totally misrepresentative of the two countries, right? Turns out it's not, because we see where they are. So isn't the GDP itself is a very big trap, in my view?
It is absolutely, completely massive trap. And I would say this is true, not just of nominal GDP, which is, just you take the currency of a country, convert it into dollars at the normal exchange rate, and, just look at their statistics and convert those into American statistics, and you get a figure. Well, that almost by definition is going to make any economy seem smaller than it really is, given the costs of things in the United States. So nominal GDP, in my opinion, is wrong. I actually go further. I think purchasing power parity GDP is a deeply misleading figure as well. Now, the statistician who first invented GDP way back, I think, in the 30s, he repeatedly said this. He said, look, I created something that was intended to be of use in academic and economic studies. I never intended it to be used as something that, people compare different economies with each other. And it's not. It was never supposed to be a race, a marker of which economy was bigger or better. It was always a profound misuse of my concept. But of course, nobody paid any attention. And the Western powers have stuck with the metric of GDP because it flatters them. It's also very easy to manipulate. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how easy it is to manipulate GDP. And it was provided to me by a fairly well-known British economist who's very critical of this as well. He said, imagine a country, let's call it Britain, where there is a big inflow of money from abroad going into its housing market. So the government allows money to come in. House prices go on rising. No houses, however, are built. In fact, you don't want houses to be built because if you do actually build houses, the cost of houses might fall, whereas you want houses to rise because that flatters your GDP numbers. Now, you then use all that money that comes in to buy goods from abroad. And you actually do. You buy them from China or Korea or Germany or wherever. And that creates a huge services industry because you have to have shops and retail outlets to trade in these goods that you're importing. And, all of these service companies, then, they're on the stock market, their shares rise, all of that. So your GDP is actually growing, even though your productive capacity might actually be falling. And the base of this, which is housing, is completely flat. And that's GDP. That is what GDP does. Now, once upon a time, and I can remember this, it's just at the tip of my memory, back in the 1960s, the measure people used to compare countries was not GDP. It was industrial growth. That was what people looked at. The assumption at that time, always being, by the way, that an industrialized country was a more modern country than a non-industrialized country. People talked about the industrialized world. Well, nobody does that anymore, because if they did that, China has a bigger industrial base than the entire global West, including Japan put together. So nobody wants to talk about that. And if we're talking about Russia, there's been a very, very detailed study done by actually a friend of mine, but it was published by BNE Intelligence, which is a trade journal that covers Eastern Europe. And it discovered that Russia's manufacturing industry, its industrial base, is actually significantly bigger than Germany's. But the GDP figures never captured it.
Yeah, and it's a trap in the sense because I think it's dangerous because Biden said that repeatedly, not on my watch that China can surpass the US, and he is talking about the GDP. But I think it can set him free if we don't use GDP and just tell them that already happened. It happened way back. Some people estimate in 2014, some earlier or later than that. Let's say 2014. So whatever you say, it's already happened. Then maybe he's less crazy. It's when you're getting close to that point, you believe somebody is going to surpass you. That's when you panic, right? If it's already happened, maybe it calms him down to deal with the reality, isn't it?
Well, indeed. And of course, what it might do is if you stop thinking of yourself being in a race all the time with other countries, which is a big mistake, you might actually start worrying about some of the real problems in your economy, which you're not doing at the moment. I mean, in my opinion, a lot of the economic policy that are being followed, especially in the United States at this present time, are precisely about goosing up the GDP figures. So you inflate the value of assets, especially stock market valuations, for example, and that works back into your GDP totals, and it makes both your growth level and your GDP look better than it really is. at least better than people really feel it. By the way, just going back to this about, how once upon a time people looked at tangibles rather than these statistical constructs to compare economies. Again, in the early 1970s, a commonly used measure for the industrial strength of a country was steel production. And I recently had the occasion to look at steel production around the world. And I discovered that China, Russia and the US both make similar quantities of steel. They make around 6 million tons of steel a day. It's a surprising number. Japan, a little more. India, around 11 million. China's about 100 million. I mean, the difference is on that kind of scale. And machine tools, which it used to be the case, and it was another important measure of understanding the modernity of an economy. China makes something like 60% of the world's machine tools. I mean, it is as economically, or at least industrially dominant today as the US was in the 1940s, probably more so. And it still has a long way to go.
Yeah, I really think it will help to make, calm down lots of the hawks in this country. If it's, it's already done, China is already surpassed it, then just let's live with it. I actually think that would be a good thing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, and before I let you go, I always trying to talk something lighter at the end, but this again may not be that light. Where is Kate Middleton? Now, we talked about this before. When we talked about it in the past, it was very gossiping kind of thing. But now it's getting serious. So this picture that they put out, turns out that there's a lot of manipulations about the picture. Okay, so they have to take it down. In any event, it seems to me like they cannot produce a decent picture of her. Now, even let's say she is gravely ill, how gravely ill is she if they cannot produce a decent picture of her? So what is going on?
Well, what is indeed going on? I mean, it's start beginning to look like what used to happen in the Soviet Union, where we were told that their leaders were in the peak of health, and we'd have sort of retouched pictures of them, and of course, all that did was trigger even more speculation. Let us take a slightly more light view about this. The amount of anger that has been directed at us, the public, for asking these questions in Britain would astonish you. I've been reading articles after article now starting to appear in the British media, especially the more right-wing media, which is more monarchist by definition, telling us that we are busybodies and should mind our own business. I mean, it's really quite funny. I mean, she's only, the Princess of Wales, after all. We shouldn't really inquire about what the condition of the future Queen is. That's absolutely, tactless and inappropriate. And by no means, under any circumstances, should we query post-fit photos or pictures of her either, or demand more details. I mean, it really is. Actually, that aspect of it is becoming pretty funny for me, I have to say.
You know what the Chinese media is saying? They said, remember Peng Shuai? They were keep on asking, where is Peng Shuai? Where is Peng Shuai, right? They are paying so much attention, even though she came out herself again and again. She even called the International Tennis board, the chair, to just tell everybody, I'm live and well, I'm here, and posting different pictures of her celebrating things with her family, etc. That's still not enough. They are still asking, where is she? In this case, there is not a single decent picture they can produce, but we cannot ask that question. I mean, the hypocrisy there, that's why the Chinese media was making fun of this. Like, where is she? Can we ask that question?
Well, indeed, absolutely. I mean, and more and more people are asking this question in Britain as well. Otherwise, there wouldn't be these angry responses. But you're absolutely correct. Now, I can remember that business with Peng Shuai. Now, can I just say that was an entirely fabricated and concocted affair? I mean, it began with a complete manipulation mistranslation of what she'd, the original thing that she'd written, which didn't say at all what it was said to say. And then, of course, the media was trying to get her to confirm their manipulated account of what she said, as opposed to that which she had really said. And she said, well, no, I didn't say that. That's not what I said at all. Why are you putting these words in my mouth? She didn't quite put it like that, but, in this kind of way. And of course, that then was used to make it seem as if she was even more under control than she really was, because she would otherwise presumably have been admitted to the truth of what the Western media said that she had said, even though she never really said it at all. I mean, the whole thing was just ludicrous, and it tells you so much about the way the media works. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of China, you have information about this person. I can remember reading in the British media and the American media how this person, how Peng Shuai had disappeared, which she hadn't done. She was all over the place. But that story was pushed out constantly. And by contrast, in this case, with Kate Middleton, who's going to become queen one day, or so we're told, well, we're not allowed to ask questions. That's absolutely unacceptable. It's tasteless, it's discourteous, it's rude to ask questions. People want to know what's going to happen to their future queen.
Yeah.
I mean, she is a public person. But there we are.
Peng
Shuai was not a public person in the same way. And that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, but yet they were pounding about this endless, It doesn't matter what she says and what she does.
Well, I mean, she was a victim of gross harassment, in my opinion, and bullying, if I have to be honest. It's Kate Middleton. The questions are not being asked by the media. They're being asked by the British public and the world media and world public. But as I said, we're not allowed to know. This is a state secret, apparently, even though it's not. But, if we do ask it, we're being rude and discourteous, and we must stop.
Yeah. And which make it even more weird. The whole story is getting more weird. Yeah. We'll be watching. Let's see what happened. I'm not really curious now what happened to her, but
so do I. So am I. Of course, that's the other effect of this. It's made people question and ask more questions than they would otherwise do. Oh, she was ill.
Yeah.
People would be sorry.
Yeah.
There'd be sympathy for her. I mean, it's strange that they don't see that.
Yeah. All right, I need to let you go. I know you have another thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
enjoyed
Sophia.
so much. Yeah, talking to you.
Me too.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.